Dear beautiful people, many of you are aware of the concept of projection, but are you aware of internalization? Well, when we are in the ego state, projection would be our default state of consciousness. Because of indoctrination and programming by society in childhood, the majority of us, if you have been listening to me, have basically exiled authentic parts of their personality or even their soul consciousness and have pushed it into the subconscious because they weren't encouraged to express those parts or were even punished for expressing those parts. Those parts formed the shadow self. The shadow self is still there, but it's not noticed by the waking consciousness. Now, the shadow self, because it is misunderstood and it is repressed and exiled from your conscious awareness during daily activities, still comes out in an unconscious but then destructive way because it's not being heard. It's not being integrated, and it creates mental illness until it is being looked at and the traumas are healed. Now, many who are in the ego state of consciousness, they will project their shadow that they judge and are in denial of onto others. Well, why do they do this? In childhood, when you express yourself authentically and you're being rejected for certain attributes and behaviors, and this forms the shadow self, then at some point you are afraid of the shadow emerging because there's a fear of re-traumatization, of being judged again, of being punished again. Now, often in conflicts, the ego state of consciousness will say, the destructive behavior is not mine, or I'm not creating the judgment, it is someone else. So basically externalizing the shadow, trying to fight or eliminate the shadow in someone else. Basically projecting one's own shadow on others that the ego uses as a canvas. And therefore it can continuously deny responsibility and pretend to be a victim. Now, this is how the mass consciousness works. But how is it actually, for example, for a mystic or a healer or a psychotherapist? I'm not saying that they are free of projection. They got to be very aware of that. But what they often struggle with is internalization. Well, what is that? So, think of a psychotherapist who does his best to teach his client how to get well. But the client is not following up. The client is not applying the techniques. The client is not owning up and not taking responsibility for his own transformation. Now, if the psychotherapist has any sense of guilt, for example, what he might do is to believe that the client cannot get past a certain threshold because he, the psychotherapist, has not been teaching the client sufficiently. But this might, in many cases, actually not be true. So then, the psychotherapist would look within himself for the issue, which often is a helpful practice if we have been projecting. But if we have not been projecting, what happens is that we start creating an issue within ourselves that previously did not exist. So if the client doesn't take responsibility, the psychotherapist might think, well, that he has not taken enough responsibility for the client. So he tries to teach even better, be more efficient, be more precise. But actually sustaining the mental illness of the client, because what the client doesn't need is pity, or that the psychotherapist takes over the responsibility for the inner transformation, takes it away from the client. That's not the psychotherapist's job. The psychotherapist's job is to help to reflect, to give tools so the self-transformation becomes possible. But this does not only happen to psychotherapists. This happens also to certain spiritual teachers or counselors or coaches. So then the whoever is the one teaching and assisting suddenly takes responsibility for something that is not theirs. It's not their responsibility. And actually sustaining the ego of whoever they are counseling by taking even more responsibility instead of calling the client into responsibility. And in this case, internalization is harmful. Pretty obviously, because the counselor will hurt himself or hurt herself, and the client doesn't learn how to own up, how to be responsible, how to be a co-creator in this world and unleash authentically his or her creative potential. Now, many who have served the world have an issue with internalization. They blame themselves for the suffering of the world, or they blame themselves for the suffering of their clients, even it's not theirs. And often I say, as a metaphor, and I find this very important, if a forest is on fire, does it help the forest if one of the trees who isn't burning also starts burning? So what I'm saying, to have compassion for someone is not to suffer with them. To suffer with them doesn't end suffering, it just adds more suffering to it. And then we have misunderstood the role that we're playing if the role that we want to play is an easing of the suffering. To ease the suffering of someone, it is absolutely not necessary to suffer with them. Quite the opposite. It's better to not start a fire within yourself if someone else cannot get past a certain threshold of consciousness. Also, sometimes certain clients might not be ready yet for a certain level of teaching, and then they need to know. And this is often what the mystics or the psychotherapists or the counselors don't like to tell someone, that they're not ready for healing yet. And that they might need to still learn through pain and suffering by experiencing the physical experience, the manifestation, as a mirror. So at some point through the pain, they're willing to give up their ego, actually be humble enough so they can open their hands or open their mind to receive something other than the conditioning that they hold on to. Now, those, for example, who have trouble loving themselves, when they enter any type of relationship, for example, love relationship, if a partner is unconscious and dysfunctional, but they're too afraid to be single, or they're too afraid to be alone and have a go at life as a sovereign being by themselves, they will, for example, rationalize the dysfunctional behavior of the partner and internalize the behavior of the dysfunctional partner and saying, it's me. Because they don't want to leave. They don't want to be alone. So therefore, they're trying to become a better partner, but it is not them. It's not their issue. But they make it their issue because there is a fear that they don't want to face. For example, the fear of being single and to be by themselves. So be aware that internalization is a thing. For the majority of people, projection is the most common phenomenon. But for some of you who are closing in on self-realization, internalization will become more of an experience, because you start identifying your projections and then you make it a habit to question yourself first. It is not a bad habit to have because you're taking responsibility for your own consciousness. But sometimes it might not be your projections, but your non-acceptance of who someone is or how they choose to express themselves in that moment. And then you have a belief or a fear in you that you don't want to accept certain things. Let's say if you think you have to be a great teacher, and you don't accept anything other than greatness. When you have a student who doesn't reach a certain level of understanding, you will constantly look within yourself, and you will internalize that, instead of understanding a certain student might have, for example, to leave your office because they're not ready for what they're doing, or they have to leave your school. Or you stop counseling them online because they're not ready to receive yet. Now, how often do beings on the mystical path beat themselves up because they cannot accept the state of consciousness of beings that they love, that they don't want to abandon or leave behind. But then you buck yourself down, you limit your energy, you're not energy efficient, and you will start developing a sense of guilt because you're trying to take a responsibility that is not yours. Now, often when we start evolving and others cannot evolve at the pace that you might be evolving or someone else might be evolving, then those relationships cannot be maintained because you cannot lower your energy, become inauthentic with those who cannot evolve at that point in time. To accept that is part of the spiritual practice. A spiritual teacher who recently visited me in meditation said to me the following thing. He said, Julian, don't look at people as if they are puppies if they are indeed wolves. What did he mean by that? When you love someone, you might want to see them better as they are. But ultimately, you might understand that every soul is precious and every soul is perfect and every soul is lovable. Though their expression in space-time as an ego is a strong limitation and they might not be capable of breaking through their ego. And their ego might have a predatory nature or a parasitic nature, that they try to draw energy from the psychotherapist or from the teacher or from whoever has compassion for them. Try to draw attention. Try to keep having conversations, but do not want to own up and do not want to improve themselves. So if we want to believe they're puppies, we do not see that they, for example, have a wolf nature. And that doesn't serve them because you need to call out their wolf nature. You need to call out their predatory behavior. And someone, for example, who acts friendly on the outside but doesn't transform but wants to keep getting the attention of someone has actually a passive-aggressive attitude and an energy parasitic attitude because they seek attention, not transformation. In those moments, and this is something that goes very profoundly against the stereotype of spiritual teacher, because many think a spiritual teacher is always gentle, always has infinite patience. But sometimes having patience with someone who is not willing to take responsibility actually harms them more than to mirror them back in an uncompromising fashion. I hope this video has been of service to you. Contemplate about that, my friends. Be well.